over the course of these webinars, we've learned about lots of things from cybersecurity to ocean pollution and sustainability, and most recently about sickle cell disease and using gene therapy in the fight against the disease. Now it's time to take a little look at history. Our journey now pivots us to a place that is a common denominator for most, if not all of us on this evening's webinar. Whether you call it Beantown, the 617, the Hub, the City of Champions, we are talking about our beloved Boston, Massachusetts. So if you think you know Boston history, I would give you pause and have you think again, because I promise you will learn some things that you did not already know. But before Dr. Nevins takes the screen and takes us on this historical tour of our complicated city on the hill, I'd like to introduce Peter Kelly, BLSA president, who in addition to celebrating his 12th anniversary as BLSA president, will provide a warm introduction to Dr. Nevins. So Peter, with that, I turn the screen over to you, my friend.
Thanks, Nicole. Always a challenge to follow your introduction to these webinars, but as Nicole mentioned, tonight we wrap up this series. But I think it's important for me to note that actually we're ending exactly where we began, because the genesis of the idea for this series happened just by chance on a Sunday night in December when I was driving, I don't know where, and was flipping through the radio, and suddenly came across a familiar voice, though one that I hadn't heard in more than 30 years. So I stopped to listen, and it was an interview with Joe, Dr. Nevins, and his co-authors from a book that they'd recently published, A People's Guide to Greater Boston. And as I listened, and I heard stories and insights that were certainly new to me, though I've lived here my whole life, it occurred to me that these would be learnings that other alumni and other folks associated with Latin School would love to hear, and it gave me a reason to be back in touch with Joe. So I reached out to him, and crickets. I heard absolutely nothing from the guy. But not being an academic, I wasn't aware that you're not supposed to contact college professors when they're in the middle of final exams and end of semester and all of that. But the idea was born, and I checked in with some folks around here, Nicole and others in the office, and some folks at the school, and people thought it was a good idea. So we reached out to some others like Richard Clark and Phil Landrigan and Berea and DeMariam, and hence was born the series. And then I reached back out to Joe, and I said, hey, look, we got this thing, and we'd really like you to be part of it. And little did he know he was the whole reason we got it going. And here he is to wrap it up for us. So I'm really delighted that he did respond to me, and that we're back in touch, and that he's here tonight. Joe is a really accomplished and widely respected academic. He's made his professional home at Vassar College for most of the last 20 years. He graduated from Middlebury and later earned a doctorate in geography from UCLA. And over the years, he's conducted field research across the globe with significant work in East Timor, Mexico, and along the US-Mexico border, where he's been able to pursue his research interests in violence and inequality, political ecology, and socioterritorial boundaries and mobility. I had to practice saying the word socioterritorial, but it seems clear to me that Joe came away from his studies of the Punic Wars with a deeper understanding of what geography means than I did, that's for sure. So I know that now we're going to more than about mountains and rivers, as tonight he talks about a topic that is really personal to all of us, and that's Boston itself. And I'm looking forward to your hearing some of the stories I heard Joe tell on the radio back in December. So Dr. Nevins, take us away.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. Can you hear me?
You are good to go.
Okay. And thank you for reminding me about the Punic Wars. It's the first time I've heard of them in quite a while. Good evening to all. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody, even though I can't see any of you. Before I proceed, I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Before I continue, I'd like to express my gratitude to Peter and Nicole for inviting me to participate this evening. It's been great to reconnect with Peter after how many years, only the heavens knows, and to meet Nicole for the first time and to have a chance to chat and experience her limitless energy. I also want to thank Kendall Grace and Lorena Prime for their assistance in getting ready for this evening. Now, what I will share with you today grows out of a book project that I began in 2014 that Peter just mentioned. It's one with my co-authors, Eleni Makrakis and Seren Mudliar, and it's entitled A People's Guide to Greater Boston. It was published last year. As the title of the book suggests, it's literally a guidebook. It's one organized around particular sites. At the same time, it's a lot more than a guidebook in that we seek to tell a story, one about Greater Boston's historical geography over 4 centuries. And like any story, Oz is selective. Our goal is not to be comprehensive, but to paint a suggestive portrait of the region. In emphasizing geography, I mean that we emphasize the matter of where, right, and the making of places. So, trying to get my slides going. Yeah. So in addition to focusing on particular sites in City of Boston neighborhoods and various municipalities north, south, and west of Boston, and this map on the right-hand side gives you an idea of the places that we explore in the book. The book tells a story about the making of Greater Boston as a region, right? An area that shares a lot, that's characterized by strong ties within and lots of divisions. We explore these ties and divisions, how they were made, challenged, and struggled over, as a way of trying to make sense of what Greater Boston was and is, while laying the foundation for it to become something better. This speaks to the approach we take, and it's one that's explicitly from below, or from the political, economic, social, and ideological margins, what we call a perspective of the people. This involves privileging the desires, hopes, and struggles of those on the receiving end of unjust forms of power, and those who work to challenge such inequities and to realize an egalitarian and socially and environmentally just Greater Boston and the world of which it is part. In working on the book, I learned a lot about Greater Boston. And what I learned most importantly, perhaps, was how little I know. So the project was both edifying and humbling. I thought about this in getting ready for tonight in relation to what was very close to me during my years at Boston Latin, but that I didn't know about or bother to investigate. So let me give it just a few quick examples. I attended Boston Latin from 1976 to 1982. A little more than a year before I graduated, an organization called International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War was founded. It was established by doctors from Harvard Medical School. The organization was a citizen initiative involving medical and health professionals in Western Europe, the Soviet Union, and the United States that aims, because I say present tense because it still exists, to eliminate nuclear weapons from national military arsenals. In 1985, the organization won the Nobel Peace Prize. I had no idea until recently that its small office was located on the second floor of a building on the corner of Longwood and Huntington Avenues, on top of Spa's drugstore, a place I spent far too much money on junk food while at Latin. A little more than a decade earlier, in 1969 to be precise, the New England Female Liberation Conference took place at Emmanuel College, just across from Latin. Out of the conference emerged something called the Boston Women's Health Collective, which produced a book called Our Bodies, Ourselves. This was a pioneering book on women's health and sexuality and a key text in the feminist movement. It has sold millions of copies over many editions, including culturally relevant ones in more than 24 languages. The book continues to be published today. Finally, in the mid-1970s, Boston was known as the arson capital of the world, of the United States. Right? The epicenter of the fires was the small Symphony Road area, about a mile from Boston Latin. Between 1974 and 1978, there were 23 major fires in a one-block area, fires that displaced hundreds and killed 5, including a 4-year-old girl by the name of Jessie Oliver. In this context, a racially diverse population of the neighborhood made up of the elderly, working class families, the poor, and students, as well as gay and lesbian residents, formed something called the Symphony Tenants Organizing Project, or STOP. With the help of Mel King, who was then a state representative from the South End, STOP was able to bring about a state task force to investigate the fires, and that led ultimately to the indictment and conviction of 32 individuals for arson and conspiracy. The convicted group included lawyers, real estate agents, insurance adjusters, excuse me, a city of Boston housing inspector, and 2 police officials, including one who led the city's arson squad. Among STOP's legacies are the Symphony Road Community Garden, which commemorates the fires and those who were killed in them, and strong investigative and prosecutorial tools related to arson for profit, tools utilized far beyond Massachusetts. I highlight these examples as a reminder of the fact that one can learn a lot about the world by simply paying attention and looking into what's in close proximity, something I often failed to do when I was at Latin. Now, rather than focusing on the Longwood Fenway area, I want to concentrate on a route that will begin in Chinatown and then proceed down Washington Street, more or less, and then down State Street to the waterfront. And I want to start in the year 1919, which was a tumultuous year, coming at the end of the Spanish flu pandemic and shortly after World War I. It was the year in which Fenway Park saw the biggest crowd in its history, more than 50,000 people. Right? They were there to support Irish independence and protest British colonialism. I should mention that this crowd was 3 times the size of the crowd that saw the Boston Red Sox win the World Series the previous year. 1919 also saw a quarter of US workers go on strike, including, most famously, Boston's entire police force. About 5 months before that, about 4,000 Boston telephone operators also went on strike. They did so for higher wages and better working conditions. And a principal site of the strike was on Oxford Street in Chinatown, where one of the city's largest telephone exchanges sat. And this is Essex and Harrison. It's the Verizon building. The back side of this building was the original telephone exchange that existed in 1919. During the 6-day work stoppage, there was no telephone service at all in the New England states except Connecticut. The women strikers, almost all of them in their teens and early 20s, were members of the telephone operators department. It was the first national trade union in the United States led and controlled by women. The Boston's local strength was an outgrowth of, among other things, the presence in the city of the National Women's Trade Union League, which was based on Boylston Street. The Trade Union League helped to organize the Telephone Workers Union in 1912. Also beneficial was the larger women's rights movement in the area. In Chinatown, neighborhood merchants set up tables behind the building to serve food to the striking workers. Meanwhile, Chinese residents helped to picket the building. Such solidarity contributed to the victory of the telephone workers. It resulted in substantial pay increases despite opposition from many male unionists and the use of strike breakers, many of whom were students from Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. The strikers were almost all Irish American women, with a small handful of Jewish workers. Until the 1940s, it was the policy of the New England Telephone Company not to hire Jews or African Americans. In addition to there being no Black workers, there were no Chinese workers as well, largely because there were very few Chinese women living in the area. And this was the result of racially discriminatory immigration laws, such as the Page Act of 1875 and the Chinese Exclusion of 1882. This was a situation that didn't change until World War II. Anti-Chinese racism was a national problem, of course, but it certainly had local roots and manifestations. In the late 1800s in Boston, Chinese immigrants were often talked about as invaders. And Chinatown, which first emerged in the area called the South Cove in 1880 or so, was seen by many, typically white Bostonians, as a place of perpetual foreignness and squalor. In 1903, Boston police and US immigration authorities conducted a huge raid in search of so-called illegal Chinese. Indicative of the racialized ways in which Chinese in Boston were depicted, the Boston Herald likened those fleeing authorities to scampering rats. In addition to revealing racism, The event illustrated the deep roots and cross-community ties enjoyed by Chinese Bostonians. 2 weeks after the raid, there was a rally in support of the Chinese community at Faneuil Hall, with several hundred in attendance, including William Lloyd Garrison Jr., son of the famed abolitionist. Chinatown, almost from its inception, has been an embattled area as a target for large infrastructural projects such as railroads, the Southeast Expressway, and more recently the Big Dig, to major institutions such as Tufts University and the New England Medical Center. Another manifestation of its embattled state is what was known as the combat zone, something those in the over 50 crowd will remember. The zone was a 5.5 acre adult entertainment district. That was how it was euphemistically described, on the edge of Chinatown. It was an area officially designated by the Boston Redevelopment Authority in 1974. And it's one that's been largely erased from the landscape. Right, this is what the center of what was the combat zone looks like today. Its main thoroughfare was Washington Street, which was formerly known as Orange Street, thus the name for the MBTA's Orange Line. In November 1976, right, here's a picture of the same site I just showed you. The combat zone in a club called the Naked Eye was at the forefront of discussions at Boston Latin. The reason being is that one late night, members of the Harvard football team stumbled out of the Naked Eye after an alcohol-fueled celebration. What transpired next is there's some disagreement about what took place, but the Harvard students ended up in a fight with 4 men who worked in the zone. During the fight, one of the men stabbed Andrew Popolo, a Harvard senior and a Boston Latin graduate. A month later, Popolo died from his wounds in the nearby Tufts New England Medical Center in Chinatown. Now, many point to Andrew Popolo's killing and a subsequent police crackdown on crime in the combat zone as the beginning of the end of this red light district. But other factors were probably more important. By the early 1980s, significant elements of the Chinatown community began calling for the combat zone's elimination. But likely even more significant were the redevelopment and gentrification of the area and the emergence of VHS recordings and the internet, which allowed people to view pornography in the privacy of their own homes. Now, continuing to think about Boston's relationship with people of Chinese descent, let's continue down Washington Street to Downtown Crossing and to the Millennium Tower, which is now Boston's tallest building. In 2014, Boston Magazine ran a story about individuals from China buying up some of the Boston area's most expensive properties. Thus, the article's title, China's Town. According to this Boston Magazine report, Boston was the world's 7th most attractive city for Chinese real estate investors. This having a lot to do with the presence of Harvard and MIT and other elite universities, as well as the biotech industry. One place the report focused on was an apartment in the Millennium Tower. The tone of the story was that the presence of Chinese capital, writ large, was something new in Boston. Now, the curious thing about this is that if you stood on the site of the Millennium Tower in the 1840s and looked across Washington Street, you would have seen the Marlborough Hotel and Chapel, right? This is right across the street from what was Filene's. Right? It stands on the site of what was Strawberry Records, for those of you who can remember the 80s and the 70s, and what later became Barnes & Noble. The Marlborough housed the first temperance hotel in the United States and a Christian chapel. It was owned by an abolitionist, and it was a primary meeting place of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass viewed it as a truly free speech alternative to Faneuil Hall. However, pro-slavery and anti-abolitionist mobs frequently threatened to disrupt meetings and attack moving speakers outside the hotel. The Marlborough was a hub for organizing and controversy in relation to many issues, including those pertaining to the evolving mid-19th century transcendentalist movement, a central figure in that being Ralph Waldo Emerson, another Latin graduate. It was also an important space for anti-war movement organizing, especially for those opposed to the invasion of Mexico by the United States in 1846. And an important figure in this movement was Henry David Thoreau, who was a frequent attendee at the Marlborough. Future suffragettes were also active in the space where they led temperance and abolitionist activities. Now, what this has to do with Chinese capital is that the Marlborough was home to something called the Great Chinese Museum from 1845 to 1847. The museum showcased fine art, costumes, and curiosities from China. It was opened by a member of a diplomatic mission from the United States, a diplomatic mission to China, led by Newburyport's Caleb Cushing, who was a former member of Congress from the state of Massachusetts. Cushing was charged with negotiating a treaty that would allow US merchants the same privileges enjoyed by British merchants. These were privileges won through the First Opium War, by which the British militarily forced China's opening to trade. Now, I should say China had long been open to trade, but the trade they were interested in, particularly the British, was trade in opium. Through this Opium War, Hong Kong was also ceded to Britain. And I should mention the opium addiction in China was a huge problem. A very large percentage of the Chinese population was addicted, including members of the royal court and high-level officials across the country. So the Chinese government had a real interest in stymieing the trade, and this was the British were opposing. Now, as a result of this, China was militarily weak, and it was eager to avoid another war with a Western power, so they agreed to US demands, and they granted Caleb Cushing and the United States, by extension, most favored nation trading status, while assuring that US nationals working in China would never fall under Chinese jurisdiction. As an aside, I should mention that the Opium War and the related decline of China's economic and political strength was a key factor in encouraging out-migration from southern China to places like Boston. Putting this aside, the Marlborough was generally a place of what we would call today progressive and alternative ideas. It was also a manifestation of Boston's status as a center of both establishment and anti-establishment thinking. It's thus interesting that a building in its back courtyard, one that fronts today on 22 Bromfield Street, would emerge in the 1970s as the longtime home of gay community news. Michael Bronski, a historian of the LGBTQ movement at Harvard, says that there were three centers of what used to be called the gay movement in the last decades of the 20th century. San Francisco, he says, was the cultural center, New York, the organizing one, and Boston was its intellectual center. Key to that was Gay Community News. It was founded in 1973 as a local newsletter, but it soon became national, a national weekly. The newspaper played an important role in uniting local and regional organizations into a national movement for gay liberation. It was widely considered the most progressive of national gay and lesbian newspapers. And this was manifest in the content of the newspaper, which reflected the broad political concerns of its editorial collective. It covered topics ranging from police brutality and nuclear disarmament to racism and US intervention in Central America. As such, many in progressive and left political circles outside of the queer community were regular readers. Continuing in the world of publishing and ideas, if we go a little further down Washington Street, right, roughly where this parking garage is located, this was once where the offices of the Daily Evening Voice were located. This newspaper emerged during the Civil War. It was a time when the trade union movement in the United States was growing in strength. Over 100 pro-worker newspapers emerged during the war. The Daily Evening Voice stood out among US labor newspapers because it was the only publication that championed the inclusion of the formerly enslaved in the labor movement. From its first issue, the Voice consistently argued for a movement that united all laborers, including women, as the only way to ensure justice for the working class. The Voice championed full civil rights and land redistribution for former slaves, as well as the 8-hour workday. It also advocated for labor schools, courses in political economy, public libraries and reading rooms, and free college education for all, given for what it saw as the necessity of educated workers to ensure deep democracy. Most striking was the Voice's rejection, and I'm quoting its editorial stance here, of all distinctions of sex, complexion, or birthplace among workers, particularly as it related to Black workers. While the newspaper only lived for a few years, its message of worker unity, irrespective of difference, is as valuable as ever. Now let's move from worker power to the power of capital by going to the end of Washington Street and taking a right onto Court Street until we get to the corner of State and Congress. Okay, you'll see in the foreground on the lower left-hand side is Faneuil Hall. Above that, you can see the Customs House, and the big tall building is 60 State Street, right? The fourth or fifth biggest building in the city of Boston. If you go to the State Street side of the building, you'll find a historical marker that tells us that it's the former site of the counting house. And a counting house is where a business conducted its operations, particularly in accounting. It was the counting house of a company called Magoon, Thatcher and Son. They were involved in merchant shipping. What's not memorialized is the far more powerful and influential multi-corporation that established its first headquarters on the site at the beginning of 1900. Now, you may recall that in the midst of and the aftermath of the Trump-inspired riot on Capitol Hill on January 6th, many leading political figures invoked the term Banana Republic. Banana Republic is a pejorative term that broadly refers to undemocratic, low-income countries, typically in Latin America. The term first appeared in O. Henry's book called Cabbages and Kings in 1904. Many understood O. Henry's use of the term to refer to Honduras, since the famed writer had lived there in the late 1890s. In using the term in relation to Trump's riot, those using it were suggesting that what was taking place was an example of what occurs in banana republics. It was antithetical to what the United States is, or at least it should be, in relatively normal times. Now, among the problems with such characterizations is that they obscure the role long played by the United States in producing so-called banana republics. They also obscure from how most of the 20th century, the proverbial banana republic's economic capital was Boston, by way of an entity known as the United Fruit Company. Again, its headquarters were at 60 State Street. The United Fruit Company was founded in 1899 through the merger of the Boston Fruit Company and the Tropical Transport and Trading Company out of New York City. In a 1926 article, the company's president, Victor Cutter, proclaimed that United Fruit had earned the title, and I'm quoting him here, the greatest farmer in the world. He also said that its activities, quote, cover almost every phase of human activity. He reported that it covered almost the company's, in terms of the geography of its activities, covered almost half of the world's banana trade and owned about 1.6 million acres of land in countries including Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, and Nicaragua. Almost 30 years later, in 1954, an article in the Globe referred to the United Fruit Company as a $500 million empire with 100,000 employees, a large fleet of merchant ships, and 1,500 miles of railroad in Latin America. The company was called the octopus by its critics. This multinational entity worked closely with its allies in Washington and overseas to secure its interests in the Caribbean and Latin America. In 1928, this entailed a dirty role in the massacre of hundreds of striking banana workers in Colombia, right? A massacre that was memorialized in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's classic book, 100 Days of Solitude. In Guatemala in 1954, it involved the United Fruit Company working with the CIA to orchestrate the overthrow of a democratic government that was seeking to nationalize and redistribute some of the company's enormous land holdings. At that time, United Fruit owned about 70% of all the private land in Guatemala. The coup in Guatemala ushered in more than 3 decades of military dictatorship and a brutal counterinsurgency war in which US-backed government forces in Guatemala killed about 200,000 people, mostly indigenous Mayans. And in 1961, United Fruit ships sailed to the Bay of Pigs as part of the US effort to overthrow the Cuban government. The United Fruit Company no longer exists. It morphed into Chiquita Brands International, but the legacy of the Banana Republic-like ties between the United States right? Ties that the United Fruit Company played a huge role in fostering endures today. United Fruit was born at the end of the so-called Gilded Age, which people date as the last few decades, roughly, of the 1800s. The Gilded Age was a time of marked economic growth, deep recession, growing concentration of wealth and income, intense labor strife, and a heavy influx of European immigrants, and many of them quite destitute. Boston's elite was divided in terms of how it perceived these changes and how to respond. And a lot of that debate played out on State Street, which was formerly known as King Street. State Street, for much of the city's history, was Boston's center of political and economic power. Thus, the presence of the old State House on one end and Long Wharf, right, the principal sea connection to the outside world, on the other. Two expressions of that debate played out in what's today known as Exchange Place. Right? One expression began on December 1st, 1988, when the first meeting of the Boston Bellamy Club took place. The very name of the club refers to socialist writer Edward Bellamy, author of the book Looking Backward. Some of you may have read it at Boston Latin. The book is set in Boston in the year 2000. The novel provides a hard-hitting critique of the 19th century industrial capitalist society and its deep socioeconomic inequities, and imagines a utopian society built on cooperation and nonviolence that comes about in the year 2000. The meeting of the first Bellamite club in the United States manifested the great popularity Looking Backward enjoyed. It was published in Boston, and it was the third largest bestseller of the time, after Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was also published in Boston, and Ben-Hur. Bellamy's book sold more than 400,000 copies in the United States alone in the first decade of its publication, and it helped to spawn 162 what were called nationalist clubs across the country. Bellamy used the term nationalism instead of socialism to capture his advocacy for the need of nationalization of industry. The great excitement and energy that Bellamy's work helped to generate was a sign of despair that many felt with the late 1800s. It also spoke to the hopes of many to bring about a fundamentally different and far more egalitarian society than the one in which they lived, and a willingness to struggle to achieve it. Of course, there were countervailing trends as well. So pretty much on the same site, less than 6 years after Boston Bellamites first meet, 3 recent graduates of Harvard, all members of the class of 1889, met at a law office where Exchange Place now sits. There they founded the Immigration Restriction League, an organization which soon spread to other US cities. Unlike the Bellamites, the League's founders saw little hope for utopian socialism, and they perceived US society at the time as one divided between a greedy plutocratic elite and an ignorant proletariat. The intellectual current they drew upon was informed by social Darwinism and eugenics, as well as an assumption that how one fared in life was tied to one's, what they called, racial stock. The League's founders saw growing threats to what they called the American race in the form of growing numbers of what they called unassimilable, low-quality immigrants of the socially inferior class. By allowing in large numbers of what they called undesirable aliens and to concentrate them in urban ghettos, the League argued that this constituted a form of race suicide. Boston at the time was experiencing the rapidly rising political influence of Irish Catholics at the expense of the city's Brahmins, as well as the arrival of growing numbers of Italians and Eastern European and Central European Jews. And for the founders of the Immigration Restriction League, this was the embodiment of the realization of the threats. Now, the League had always a small membership, but it had considerable influence, not least because of the upper class status of many of its members. And it also had ties to very powerful political figures, most notably Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who shared many of their views. The League's worldviews helped underlie the passage of highly restrictive federal immigration legislation that took place in 1921 and 1924, and helped to lay a lot of the ideological foundation that contributes to restrictionist ways of thinking that endure today. Now, at the end of State Street, as I mentioned earlier, is Long Wharf. This was built in the early 1700s. It was once a half-mile long. It was along, near, and out of Long Wharf that the United Fruit Company conducted much of its activities, including voyages to the tropics for well-heeled tourists. The origins of Boston's West Indian community is also tied to Long Wharf, as Jamaican workers or paid travelers from the Caribbean on United Fruit ships often ended up settling in the city. Now, if you go immediately south of Long Wharf, you'll be at Central Wharf, today home to the New England Aquarium, which you see on the right-hand side of this slide. In the early 1800s, Central Wharf was the base of operations of James and Thomas H. Perkins and Company. It was named after an old Boston Brahmin family that made its huge fortune off of, among other activities, slave trading in Haiti and the illegal smuggling of opium in China. Like other, the Perkins family wasn't alone in this. There were other leading Boston families that were also involved in opium smuggling, such as the Forbes family, as in John Forbes Carey, a former US Senator. Now, while Britain was responsible for the lion's share of opium smuggled into China, about 10 to 15% of it was from US-based interests, with the Perkins family being a key player. Perkins was also a philanthropist, and he used his wealth to help to fund and found the Boston Athenaeum, which still exists, the oldest private library in the United States. It's across from the State House. He also helped to found, Mass General Hospital, as well as the Perkins School for the Blind. Perkins' activities also contributed to people in Boston becoming increasingly addicted to opium, as the Perkins ships often returned not only with Chinese porcelain, tea and silk, but also opium. I should mention that the famed Essex Peabody Museum in Salem, which has probably one of the best collections of Asian art in the United States, was also founded and funded largely through opium money. Now, these various sites speak to the nature of places. Just like individuals, places have multiple identities. They're also bundles of connections and are both products and producers of a larger world. The connections between Boston and various countries, connections born in many ways of various forms of violence, from the slave trade to opium smuggling to US militarism, also help explain why significant populations from China, Colombia, Guatemala, Haiti, and Jamaica now reside in the city. Ambalavanir Sivanandan, he's a British Sri Lankan political analyst. He once explained the presence of immigrants in the United Kingdom from former British colonies by saying, "We are here because you were there. We are here because you were there." That certainly applies to Boston. Finally, let's look across the water to East Boston, home to Logan Airport. If at one time the sea was almost exclusively Boston's connection to the world, it is increasingly by air that Boston connects. Even much of the fish consumed in Boston now arrives by plane, one of the consequences of the area's depleted fishing stocks. Logan now makes up almost 2/3 of East Boston's land. Due to its eating up more and more of the neighborhood's land, including residential areas and public parks, and all the pollution related to Logan's operation, Logan was a frequent target of neighborhood protests beginning in the 1960s and 1970s. Logan is a major contributor to climate breakdown. Flights from Logan alone are responsible for millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions each year. The emissions from Logan exceed the total annual emissions for all activities generated by a number of the world's lowest income countries, such as Haiti and Niger. Curiously, however, if you look at the City of Boston's reports that focus on climate change, they say almost nothing about the airport. In fact, the city does not include flights as part of its measurements of Boston's carbon footprint. Were Boston to do so, it would become clear that cutting CO2 emissions necessitates a radical downsizing of Logan. Like Chinatown, East Boston is one of Greater Boston's sacrifice zones, an area where many of the most dangerous activities in terms of public health and environmental well-being are concentrated. It's also one of the areas most endangered by rising sea levels and climate change. Last week, WBUR ran a series of reports on what this means for Boston. I encourage people to look at it online. With about 1/6 of the Boston area's land, made land, in other words, reclaimed from the sea, filled in as mudflats, etc., much of the city and nearby municipalities, such as Revere, are greatly threatened, right? Requiring, among other things, coastal retreat, not more waterfront development. Now, adapting to this new and intensifying reality requires a transformation that's difficult for us to even imagine, let alone carry out. Perhaps by drawing lessons and inspiration from those who have come before us in Greater Boston, we can gain some insight in how to do so, and to do so in a manner that is democratic, just, and sustainable. So let me stop there and say thank you and open things up for comments and questions. Let me just mention that if you want to follow this project, which continues, we'll continue to post new sites and research as we learn more. You can find us at bostonbook.org. You can also follow us on Facebook at this address, Greater Boston Book. So again, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Nevins. I have many thoughts, and I guess I'll start with, the old adage that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often does rhyme, unfortunately. So, if we're smart, we will take these lessons and learn and be better and engaged citizens. I also have to say that you warmed the cockles of my heart when I saw the pictures of Spars, the land of the best toasted cinnamon roll and Cliff Notes. And those of you who go back pre-1990 know exactly what I'm talking about. So thank you for bringing us down memory lane, and certainly for such insightful history. I think many of us claim to be good historians and good scholars of our beloved city, but clearly there are some points where things are a little messy and certainly a bit complicated. And your book goes into just amazing detail with all of that. To remind our audience, to ask a question, you'll want to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So while we wait for a couple of those to line up, let me ask you one question to start, if I may. Your book goes through many neighborhoods, all the neighborhoods in Boston, and certainly adjacent cities, both north, west, and south of here. But was there anything particularly shocking or surprising that you learned during the research for the book?
Well, first, Nicole, thank you for reminding me about Cliff Notes. Yes, I purchased many of those at Spars. There were certainly many surprises, right? In terms of, there were lots of things I simply didn't know. So I'll, just give you an example. On Hanover Street, right? Hanover Street used to continue into its today government center. Right? That was Scully Square. And on that side of Hanover Street, there used to be something called the American House. It was one of the oldest hotels in Boston. And in 1858, a guest checked into that hotel. His name was John Brown. John Brown of John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And John Brown was there to meet with what were called the Secret Six. These were his primary supporters and strategists, and as well as fundraisers. And this was their initial meeting to plan the raid that took place the next year at Harper's Ferry, and was a seminal event in raising the tensions that led to the outbreak of the Civil War. So things like that were surprising. I was constantly learning new things. In terms of shocking things, one resource that we relied heavily on in terms of the images in the book, we have about 150 images in the book or so, something called Digital Commonwealth, which is it's a fantastic resource if you haven't seen it. It combines all these research institutions: the Boston Public Library, Northeastern University Library, Massachusetts Historical Society, Historical New England, And they just merge all their digital archives, and you can find all sorts of things on there. And I was looking for something, and I can't remember the reason why, related to the Charlestown Navy Yard. And if I could share my screen, I'm going to do that again. I can just show you what I found. So this is a photo from 1934. It's a Charlestown Naval Yard. And what we see is, on the second person from the left, is Nazi Germany's ambassador to the United States. And then the three leading officers of the Karlsruhe. Karlsruhe was a ship that was on a goodwill tour of the United States, and its first stop was Boston. Right? You'll notice the Nazi SWAT sticker in the background. Now, it turns out, while many in Boston welcomed Karlsruhe, there was a significant protest of its presence, led by trade unionists, anti-fascist organizations, members of Boston's sizable Jewish community, students, etc. And that protest took place in City Square, right, which is very close to the Charlestown Naval Yard. And when the protesters gathered there, it happened to be around the rush hour in the afternoon. So at that time, there was the Orange Line, which was elevated, had a station there. And so a lot of people were getting off of work. So hundreds of people were flooding into the square. And a contingent of students from Harvard University who were pro-Nazi Germany also showed up. They were there to help the police, right? They were there to help the police the demonstrators. Fights broke out, and there was a riot in which the police beat up and bloodied many of the anti-Nazi demonstrators. Right? This was celebrated, the police riot was celebrated in the pages of many of the Boston newspapers. But what transpired afterwards, in many ways, really speaks to the level of anti-Semitism and pro-Nazi sentiment that was present in Boston. I really knew nothing about, and I just want to read, if I could, from the book. So here's how the Herald, the media coverage of the Karlsruhe visit was generally very positive in the mainstream press. And here's what the Herald wrote. I'm quoting the Herald here. Each member of the ship has this common denominator: an impeccable appearance, a knowledge of English, and a charming old world courtesy. They were, in short, a joy to the feminine heart, and made that poor fellow, the average American, seem a bit shabby by contrast. Okay, that's the end of the quote. Let me just read a little more. This is our writing now. State and society followed suit, holding various events welcoming Hitler's military. They included official visits to City Hall and the State House, and a dinner and dance at Boylston Schulverein, a Jamaica Plain-based German-American club, followed by a soccer game the next day. The culmination was a banquet the evening of the City Square protest. Nearly 1,000 people, among them local German Americans, representatives of the city, and of several veterans organizations, assembled at the Back Bay's Copley Plaza Hotel to celebrate the Karlsruhe officers and sailors. Hanging above the posh gathering were the Nazi SWAT sticker, the Stars and Stripe, and Germany's flag. According to the Globe, the speakers, and I'm quoting the Globe here, talked of friendly relations between the two countries, defended Germany's economic program, attacked the world boycott against Germany, derided agitation against German-American societies, and gave stiff-arm Nazi salutes. And so even though the anti-labor practices of the Nazis were well known, and certainly the anti-Semitism and the broad political repression, the anti-Semitism and pro-Nazi sentiment was significant in Boston, and that I found quite shocking.
Indeed. Thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions in the queue, and yeah, we've got a few minutes to answer. So let's roll with these. So, question number one, Dr. Nevins, is, and certainly a hot topic here in Boston, particularly these days. But what is your view on whether we should rename places like Faneuil Hall, or instead add plaques and educational materials to explain the complex history?
Oh, someone's trying to get me in trouble.
Oh.
yeah, I don't, you know, it's a tough question, and it's one I need to give a lot more thought to. I understand and appreciate the concerns that people have raised. Um, you know, I think like if we had to, so, you know, let's just take Faneuil Hall as an example. Right, and for those people who aren't familiar with this, the reason people are protesting Faneuil Hall is because Peter Faneuil made his money, you know, who donated the hall to the city of Boston, made his money to a large degree through the slave trade. Right? You know, a lot of the money that Boston is built upon is derived from gross injustices. Right. I mean, I talked about the United Fruit Company, for example. Right. I talked about the Perkins family. Were we to engage in renaming, it's a very, very slippery slope. And I myself don't see the name as a problem. What I see as a problem is the lack of appreciation or knowledge that's often exists about what's behind the name. And I think what's much more important than changing the name is changing how we understand those names. The fact is, Peter Faneuil and his money is part of who we are. And I think we need to own that. And thinking about that, so I'm more in favor of having education, you know, having all sorts of educational displays at Faneuil Hall that talk about the sordid past associated with Peter Faneuil. And again, owning the fact that that's part of who we are and what Boston is. You know, again, I'm very open to conversation about this, and I welcome debate about this because I appreciate it's a sensitive and complicated issue.
Certainly, thank you. Let me ask this, and it's funny because we say this to all of our guests. We feel like we could do a part 2 because there's just so much, you know, good and useful information, important information as well. Another question is, you know, we'd love to hear about the similar patterns of dispossession along Washington Street in the other direction. So Dudley Square, South End, et cetera. I know you lay some of this out in your book, but is there a snippet or anything that immediately comes to mind that that you might share that talks about that?
And when say the dispossession
along, I guess, the displacement, or sort of similarly how we walked, you know, through Chinatown and talked about specific things there.
Yeah, so, you know, what I should have mentioned that, you know, around the Millennium Hotel, that when it was the Millennium Tower, when that was being built, organizations like the Chinese Progressive Association out of Chinatown were protesting the Millennium Tower itself because they see that as part of a larger process of dispossession. You know, lots of people are being driven out of Chinatown because of gentrification and real estate speculation. And a similar process, of course, has unfolded in the South End. There's been a remarkable transformation of the South End since, you know, I was in Boston, Latin, and increasingly in Roxbury. So one of the things that's of great concern, you know, in Dudley Square, now called Nubian Square, and areas before that between Northeastern University and Nubian Square, is the growing influence and presence of places like Northeastern University. Right? And right now there's a big debate about the building of a Northeastern dormitory in that area. Right? And so there's all sorts of ways, sort of these struggles, you know, what many people call the right to the city, unfold. Who is it that determines who gets to stay, who gets to live, and how we live in the city? I mean, it's not unique to the area of Washington Street that I showed. And, you know, as the struggle or the debate over Northeastern University near Nubian Square shows, this unfolds in Roxbury and certainly in many places in the South End. Mission Hill, of course, is sort of classic, right? Mission Hill has changed radically since the 70s and 80s. I mean, I think maybe even the majority of people that now live in Mission Hill might be associated with what they call meds and eds, right? The medical establishment and educational institutions. That's far from what it was in the 70s and 80s.
Okay, thank you. We're going to try one more question. And again, we have some in queue, so I'm going to ask a question and then I'll ask the question. For questions that we don't have time to address during our webinar, we'll collect those, and perhaps if your time permits, we might direct those questions to you if you'd like to answer, and we could possibly get them back to the people who are asking, because they are great questions. I just don't want us to run out of time. I want to be mindful of everyone's evening. But let me ask one more question of you. Do you see any signs of hope regarding Boston's ability to show a way forward on income inequality as we have in the past on so many critical issues?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, hope is something that we produce, right?
Mhm.
And I would argue that it's produced in part through struggle. It sort of, I mean, it sort of raises what used to be called the $64,000 question. Like, how do you make positive change? And, again, like, I draw inspiration in part from what has taken place before and what continues to unfold today. So there are all sorts of organizations throughout Boston and throughout the Boston area that are addressing issues of inequality. And in that sense, hope is in the process of being built, of being produced. But clearly, given the gross inequities that characterize Boston and Greater Boston, there's a whole lot of work we need to do. And so in that regard, I would encourage people to look at a book. It was written many years ago by Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian pedagogue, and Miles Horton, one of the founders of the Highlander Institute in Tennessee, which is still around today. People like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, sort of giants of the civil rights movement, studied there. And the title of the book was something like Making the Road by Walking It. Right? There's no recipe or 10-step plan to transform the world. What we need is an ability to identify a problem, to name it as such. We need an analysis of why that problem exists. We need a vision of something better. In this case, an egalitarian or a less unequal Boston. And we need a willingness to struggle to realize that vision. And in the process of struggling to realize that vision, we're going to make a lot of mistakes, right? But we're in the process of doing it. If we do so with a sort of an open heart and an open mind, we'll eventually build that world. We'll build that road, right? By walking it. So that's where I derive the hope, right? By walking that road. So let's do that.
There it is. Well said. You must have gone to Latin. Thank you. And thank you for your candor. I have to say, the only thing I enjoy more than your presentation and your thoughtfulness and your candor is your Bostonian accent. I love it. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck need to look for you for their next next movie. So we are right at the 1 hour mark, and I just again want to take a moment. I realize that we have a few other questions in queue, but we'll collect those. We'll get answers to you as soon as we're able. So thank you for your engagement with this. And Dr. Nevins, thank you for just imparting your wisdom and your knowledge. I could sit here and listen for another hour or two to all of the great information that you have to share. As we mentioned, Dr. Nevins' book, A Greater People's Guide to Greater Boston, was published in 2020. So you can find it on, your local bookstores, wherever you shop for those, you will certainly find that. And I want to take a moment and thank you all for joining us again for our finale of this season's Inquiry and Insights speaker series. On behalf of Boston Latin School and the Association, we specifically want to thank the many of you that made contributions to the BLSA Annual Fund, which helps to support this and the many programs that have helped our BLS students not just thrive, but really survive and really knock the ball out of the park during this past academic year. So on behalf of everyone involved, we thank you so very much. And we wish you and your families a wonderful and safe summer. Thank you so much, and take great care, everyone.